silence in that exam room was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My brother stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at the attending physician like he was the most important person in the building. Which, to be fair, he thought he was. He always thought he was. "She's just a medical student," he said, waving a hand in my direction without looking at me. "Can we get an actual doctor in here?" The attending looked at him. Then he looked at him. Then he looked at the badge clipped to my white coat, not the student badge, not the rotating intern badge, the one that said what I actually was now. He cleared his throat. "Dr. Callahan is the surgeon on this case, sir." My brother's head turned slowly toward me. I watched the exact moment it landed. I didn't smile. I just picked up the chart. People always ask me when things went wrong with my brother. The honest answer is that I don't think things were ever right. Not in the way siblings are supposed to be right, where you fight sometimes and forgive and fight again. But underneath everything there's bedrock. With Owen, there was never any bedrock. There was just the performance of a family. He's 7 years older than me. By the time I was old enough to understand anything, he had already been told he was exceptional. My father had a gift for making one child feel chosen and the other feel like a footnote. Owen was the story. I was the asterisk. I want to be fair. Owen isn't stupid. He's actually quite smart. In the narrow corridor where his intelligence lives, he can read a room, he can talk to anyone, he can make you feel like you're the most interesting person he's ever met for exactly as long as he needs something from you. That's a skill. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But he confused charisma for capability his whole life, and nobody around him thought to correct him, so he never did either. I decided I wanted to be a doctor when I was 11. I don't remember a specific moment, a single event, a teacher who changed my life. I just remember looking around at the people who mattered in my small world and thinking, I want to be the person who can actually fix something, not talk about fixing it, not make someone feel better momentarily about something broken, actually fix it. Owen thought it was hilarious. He said at the dinner table that year, in front of both my parents, in front of his girlfriend at the time whose name I've since forgotten, are going to be a doctor. He said it like someone reading a typo out loud, like the sentence itself was the joke. My father laughed. Not cruelly, I don't think. He wasn't a cruel man, just a careless one. He laughed and said something like, "That's ambitious, sweetheart," and then the conversation moved on. My mother had died 3 years before. There wasn't anyone at that table who was going to say, "Actually, let's take this seriously." So I took it seriously myself. The thing about deciding to become a surgeon when no one believes you is that it teaches you something useful, very early. You stop waiting for permission. You stop looking sideways to see if anyone is clapping. You learn to run on a fuel source that doesn't require anyone else's approval to keep burning, because if you don't, you'll stop. And I was not going to stop. I studied. I mean that in the way that only people who've been through it understand. Not the normal studying. Not the kind where you close the book at midnight and feel good about yourself. I mean the kind where you're still at the library at 2 in the morning and the cleaning crew has learned your name and sometimes leaves you a coffee. The kind where you stop dreaming about normal things and start dreaming about pathophysiology. The kind where your social life is not postponed but genuinely abandoned. Not because you're sad about it, but because you simply don't have the bandwidth, and also because you've realized, somewhere along the way, that the people asking you to prioritize them over your work are almost always people who will not be around when you need them. Owen called every few months. The calls got shorter as I got further. When I got into medical school, he said, good for you. Like I'd told him I'd won a small prize at a county fair. When I matched into general surgery residency, he said nothing at all. My father mentioned it to him, and apparently Owen said he didn't know surgery was something you had to match into, which told me everything I needed to know about how closely he'd been paying attention to my life. I did 6 years of residency. If you haven't been through a surgical residency, I'm not sure I can explain it to you in terms that don't sound dramatic, but I'll try. You become a different person. Not in a poetic way. In a literal, biological, fundamental way. In a literal, biological, fundamental way. Your relationship with sleep changes permanently. Your relationship with fear changes. You hold a human heart in your hands and you understand something about both your own power and your own smallness that cannot be untaught. You make mistakes and you live with them in a way that civilian life doesn't prepare you for. Because in most jobs, a mistake means redoing the work. And in surgery, a mistake means something else entirely. You grow up fast and rough. Owen, in that same 6 years, changed jobs twice, had 3 relationships, bought a boat he never used, and called my father regularly to complain that life wasn't delivering what he deserved. I came home for Christmas in my 3rd year of residency. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and had driven 3 hours in bad weather because my father had asked, and I was still, even then, someone who showed up when my father asked. Owen was there with his girlfriend, a different one I couldn't keep track, and within 20 minutes of arriving, he had managed to make a comment about how I looked tired. A comment about how I looked tired. A comment about how I must have it easy since surgeons just do the same thing over and over. And a comment directed at the girlfriend that I was always like this at family things, kind of checked out. I ate my food and drove home in the dark. I told myself I was used to it. The body can get used to almost anything if the doses are small enough and spread out enough over time. I finished residency. I did a fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery, hearts and lungs, the dramatic stuff, the cases that make other surgeons stop what they're doing to watch. I was good at it. Not in the way people say that to be modest. I was genuinely, measurably, documentably good at it. My hands were steady. My decisions were fast and accurate. I had a particular calm under pressure that my attendings kept commenting on, and I knew where it came from. When you have spent years in a room where nobody expects you to succeed, you learn to be very, very still inside yourself. I took a position at a hospital in the city, not a small hospital, a major academic medical center, the kind that has its own zip code effectively, that trains half the surgeons who will eventually train the next generation, that has a reputation that precedes it by several time zones. I had my own patients, my own OR days, my own team. I didn't tell Owen. I told my father, who said he was proud of me, which was the first time I remember him saying that without any qualification attached. I told a few friends from residency. I didn't make an announcement. I've never been a person who makes announcements. I figure the work announces itself eventually, or it doesn't, and either way the announcement isn't the point. Owen found out the way he found out most things about me, through my father, late, with details missing. He called me once, around that time. I was between cases. He said congratulations, in the particular tone he used for things that confused him, like congratulations was a word he'd looked up and wasn't sure he was using correctly. Then he said, so you're like, what, doing heart surgery? Cardiothoracic surgery, yes. Huh. A pause. That's good money, right? I said yes. He said that was good, and that was the end of the call. My father had his first cardiac episode on a Tuesday in February, which I know not because I have a perfect memory, but because I had 2 bypass surgeries scheduled that day and I had to hand them off, which I remember in the way you remember any disruption to a rhythm you've built carefully and protected fiercely. He was stable by the time I arrived. Owen was already there. He lived closer, and also he was the kind of person who moved fast toward dramatic situations and slow toward difficult ones. He had stationed himself in the waiting area like he was managing the crisis, talking to the nurses, introducing himself, asking questions that showed he hadn't looked anything up but wanted to appear like he had. When I walked in, still in my hospital clothes, badge visible because I had come directly, he looked at me with something that I can only describe as irritation at my presence, like I was encroaching. She's just a medical student, he said to the attending who had appeared in the doorway. Old habit, maybe. Reflex. He hadn't updated the file he kept on me since I was 25 years old and just starting, and he wasn't someone who revised his files. The attending, whose name was Dr. Pucker, Mercer, and who I had actually consulted with several months earlier, on a shared patient, looked at my badge with the calm recognition of a person reading a sentence they already know. Dr. Callahan is the cardiothoracic surgeon on your father's case, he said. She's been briefed. Owen's mouth didn't open exactly. It just stopped doing whatever it was doing before. I looked at him for 1 second. Just one. Then I turned to Dr. Mercer and we started talking about my father's ejection fraction. I want to tell you that the moment felt triumphant, that it was clean and bright and satisfying the way that vindication is supposed to feel in the stories we tell ourselves about our lives. It didn't really. What I mostly felt, standing in that hallway, was tired. Not the residency kind of tired, the physical collapse kind. A different kind. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that even when you set it down, you can still feel the weight of it in your body like a phantom. I had been proving myself to Owen since I was 11 years old. I had been doing it without meaning to, without choosing to, without his awareness. He certainly wasn't watching. but my body had been keeping score even when my mind tried not to. He didn't say anything to me that day about the badge or the title or the correction. He asked about our father's prognosis, and I explained it, carefully, clearly, without condescension, which took effort, and he nodded like he was taking it in. Maybe he was. I genuinely cannot tell you what happens inside Owen when reality asks him to revise something he's believed for 30 years. I don't have that kind of access to him, and I'm not sure I want it. My father's case was complex but survivable. I wasn't the primary surgeon on his procedure. I recused myself because you don't operate on family. That's not a rule I invented, it's a rule that exists for excellent reasons. But I was there. I scrubbed in as a second pair of hands. I stood at that table and I helped. And afterward, when my father was in recovery and finally awake enough to see me, the first thing he said was, "I knew you'd be here." That was the moment that cracked something open in me. Not Owen's face in the hallway, my father saying that. Because it meant he had known, all along, in some chamber of himself, he hadn't always opened the door to. He had known what I was capable of. He just hadn't always remembered to say it out loud, and you can love someone and still need more from them than they know how to give. And that can be true and painful and also just true. Owen and I didn't have a dramatic conversation. No confrontation in a parking garage, no raised voices, no speech I had prepared and finally delivered. Life isn't usually that satisfying, and I'd stopped expecting it to be. What happened was quieter. He came to my office once, a few weeks after my father was discharged. I don't know what he expected when he got there. I think maybe he hadn't planned it out, had just found himself driving in the direction of the hospital and kept going. He sat down across from my desk and looked at my diplomas on the wall and my name on the door and the 2 pages of case notes I'd been working on when he came in. And he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know it was like this." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have." And then he stopped. And I watched him try to find the right ending for that sentence, and I watched him not quite get there. I said, "Yeah," and that was it. That was the conversation. It's not the one you'd write if you were writing fiction. It doesn't resolve cleanly. He hasn't become a different person, and I don't expect him to. We talk sometimes more carefully than we used to, with less taken for granted. I don't know if that's forgiveness exactly, or just the arrangement that 2 adults arrive at when they've decided to remain in proximity, and the old arrangement isn't available anymore. My father came to my hospital once after he recovered, when I had a free hour in the middle of the day. I showed him my OR. I showed him the view from the 7th floor. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets looking out at the city, and he said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Your mother would have had something to say about all of this." I said, "What do you think she'd say?" He smiled. "Something embarrassing, in front of everyone." We had lunch after. It was the best lunch I can remember. I have a resident on my team right now. She's 28, and she's the kind of person who makes the other residents nervous because she's just that good. Not showy about it, not performing confidence she doesn't have. Just genuinely steady and quick and right. She reminds me of myself at that age, though I'd never say it to her face because she'd find it corny, and she'd be correct. Last week, she was presenting a case in the hallway, and one of the attendings from another department, older, the kind of man who learned his habits in a different era, cut her off mid-sentence to ask if she could get one of the actual surgery team to come explain this. She looked at him. She didn't flinch. She said, "I am the surgery team, Dr. Aldridge. Would you like me to continue?" He had the grace to look briefly ashamed. She continued. I caught her in the hall afterward and said, "Good," she said. "Has that happened to you?" I thought about the hallway in my father's hospital unit. The badge on my coat. My brother's face arranging itself around a fact it hadn't expected. "A few times," I said. She nodded. "Does it stop?" "No," I said. "But you stop waiting for it to stop. That's the part that changes." She looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether to believe me. Then she went back to work. That's the thing about this field, and maybe about any field where you've had to fight for every inch of ground. The work doesn't stop for you to have your moment. The next case is already waiting. The next patient is already there. You take the small victories where they land, and then you wash your hands and you go back in. My name is on that door. My name is on that door. My name is on those diplomas. My father knows what I do now. And somewhere in the hospital right now, a person is on a table and I am the person they are counting on. Not because I proved something to my brother in a hallway, but because I was in that library at 2 in the morning when nobody was watching, and I did the work. And that work compounded over 20 years into something real. That's the only vindication that ever actually lasts. The other kind, the moment in the hallway. You get about 3 seconds of it, and then the next thing arrives, and you have to be ready. I've always been ready. I made sure of that a long time ago. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that day in the hallway. Not in a dramatic way, I'm a surgeon, I think in systems. Every outcome has a chain of events behind it. And if you trace that chain back far enough, you find the small decisions nobody noticed at the time. The choice to stay in the library at 2 in the morning. The choice to not let one dismissive comment at a dinner table become the story I told myself about what I was allowed to become. Those choices compounded. That's not magic. That's just math applied over time. Owen didn't make me into who I am. I want to be clear about that. People who underestimate you don't deserve that kind of credit. What he did, without knowing it, was remove a safety net I might have leaned on if it had existed. When nobody is watching for you, when nobody is holding the door, you learn to find the door yourself. That's not a gift I would have asked for. But it's the one I got, and I decided, somewhere around age 14, to use it. The thing about integrity is that it doesn't announce itself. Owen was charming and loud and present in every room he entered, and for years that looked like capability from a distance. But integrity is what you do when the performance ends. It's the 2 a.m. studying when no grade is due tomorrow. It's the correct call in the OR when the easier call is available and nobody would know the difference. It's telling your resident the truth, that it doesn't get easier, but you get steadier, instead of telling her something comfortable that will eventually fail her. Integrity is just the accumulation of small, honest choices made when nobody's keeping score. I made those choices. They became my record. My record became my name on that board. What I didn't expect was how little the vindication moment would matter, and how much the moment with my father in recovery would matter instead. He said, "I knew you'd be here," and something in me that had been braced for 20 years finally exhaled. Not because I needed his approval to validate what I'd built, I didn't. Not anymore. I had long since stopped running on that fuel. But because it turned out he had known, quietly, in the way that people who love you badly sometimes still see you clearly. He just hadn't known how to say it until the moment made him. That's the part I carry now. Not Owen's face in the hallway. That was 3 seconds, and then it was over. What I carry is the understanding that the work you do in private, the standards you hold yourself to when no one is grading you, the person you choose to be in the small, unremarkable moments. That's the whole thing. That is the entire enterprise. The hallway moment is just what happens when that pride at work eventually has to be witnessed by someone who wasn't paying attention. My resident asked me if it stops. I told her no, but that you stop waiting for it to stop. I meant that. The world will keep producing people who look at you and see something smaller than what you are. You cannot fix that. What you can do is make the gap between their assessment and your reality so wide that even they eventually have to acknowledge it, and then move on before they finish processing it, because you have work to do. I have work to do, I always have.